Now, as tempting as it is to start gluing things together, we're not quite ready. We still have more work to do on the legs. We've got a little bit of a taper to put, which we'll get to later. Now we're going to focus on putting a dado in the inside of the legs. That's going to hold a shelf in place. The cool thing about this shelf is it's not just for function, to work as a shelf. It's also supporting the structure, kind of like a stretcher does on a chair or between table legs. So we need to be able to cut this dado very accurately, and we have to keep in mind that our legs are mirror images of one another. So we can't just use the same setup for all 4 of our legs. We use one setup for 2 and another setup for the other 2. So let's head to the table saw and I'll show you what we have to do. I smell chicken. All right, so at the table saw, I've got a 3/4 inch wide dado stack. It's about 3/8 high. That's going to be our depth of our dado. And the way we're going to have to visualize this cut, see, we've got our lines here that tell us where we need to be. This cut is parallel to the top. So theoretically, if it were safe to actually run this piece like this, and we had the fence set at the right spot, where that blade goes right where we want it, you could make the cut just like this, right? Obviously that's really unsafe, so we're gonna have to come up with a better solution. But this is the front right leg. Watch what happens on the front left. Fence stays in the same position, but we go in the opposite orientation. And if we go like that, we are still having our pencil lines line up with our blade, and we can go ahead and make that second version of the cut. So the way we're gonna stabilize this is with a small miter gauge. You don't want anything too big because you want to be able to fit in this space. You can go to the left of the blade if you wanted to. If you needed to, just make sure you have the support you need. I'm more comfortable making this cut holding the workpieces in this position. So when this workpiece is up against the fence and the gap is closed in here, that's when you want to bring, I don't even care what the angle is. I just want to make sure this is supporting the workpiece with the workpiece at the angle that I want. So whatever that is, no gap here, no gap here, we lock that sucker down, and then we should be able to make that cut right on through. I've also decided to add a little sacrificial fence here, just some double stick tape, piece of scrap, and this is going to help support the fibers when we go through so we don't get a lot of tear out. We can cut both the front right and rear left with this setup. Once those are done, we can change the angle of the miter gauge and cut the front left and rear right. For safety and accuracy, it's best not to bring the workpiece back across the blade while it's still spinning. So the next thing we're going to do is add our taper to our legs. Oh, recording right after lunch. That's a bad idea. So next thing we need to do is add a taper to the legs. So on the outside face, we're going to bring it in by about 3/8 of an inch. At the foot, it'll taper all the way out to the top point there where we don't remove material. So the way that I think is easiest to get this done is at the planer. So I've got a piece of plywood, just 3/4 inch plywood as a base. If I could somehow tilt the leg up and run this through the planer, I could get a nice even taper all the way across very easily, very quickly. So what I'm going to do is have 2 of these here. You could do 2 at once. Bring them together. Then I'm going to raise it up by 3/8 of an inch, or maybe a little bit less. But I've cut a little shim here. I'm going to put that under the legs as far down as I can. This guy is going to be something we'll use to help immobilize these pieces, because as it's going through the planer, the motion is this way. It wants to kick the workpiece back toward us. So I have to do something here by attaching a stop block that prevents that from happening. And then at the other end, we'll just use a little double stick tape. We will also use shims to support the workpiece all the way down so that when the pressure rollers hit, we don't create a bow. All right, so first thing I want to do is notch this little extra piece here. That's going to be our stop. So I'm bringing these 2 together, trace around, and we'll cut that at the bandsaw. All right, so if you can imagine this guy being in position, these legs just kind of pop in like that. It's looking pretty good. So now we can attach this. Now we will put our 3/8 shim in here. I'm not going to glue this in because if I see something weird, maybe it's taken off too much material, I may have to change this shim, but right now I think it's probably just fine. These guys will go in like so. At the far end here, at the top of the legs, I'm going to throw in some double stick tape. Now we're not going to get full contact with this, right? Because the piece is lifting up, but something's better than nothing. And finally, I'm just going to use some offcut shims from, these are probably from the legs, and I can put them in like so, push them up to the point that they catch. Let's do one. Just at the point where it gets wedged in there, you don't want to lift it. Just let it catch. Okay, now we're on 3. Let's head to the planer. Right now, when setting up the planer, you don't want to set up for this height, you want to set up for the highest point. See how much higher that is? So we'll raise the height until we know we're just taking a little bit off of that area. Now we could flip it around. I should also mark up each surface. That'll help me gauge my progress. All right, so by the time we remove material, just start to remove material up here, we should be at the line. If you drew a line, taking 3/8 away, you should be pretty close. It doesn't have to be dead on. This is just an aesthetic thing. You can make a more severe taper, or you can make even less or none at all, right? But that worked pretty well. All right, so once I had my legs done, I kind of looked at the taper and decided I needed a little bit more drama there. So instead of taking 3/8 off, I took off a full 1/2 inch, bringing myself down to about 1 inch at the feet. And the way you do that, super easy. I used the same shim, but all I had to do was put a little CA glue on there and slide it up until that extra 1/8 was lifted up. And this is now in place, but again, it's a one-time use jig, so who cares? All right, so with all of that done, now we need to add some edge treatments, get ourselves ready for a little bit of glue up, because doing all the edge treatments and sanding after the glue up is going to be a pain in the butt, so let's get to it. Pretty much all the edges will get an 1/8 inch roundover. All the flats get scraped to remove the tool marks and then sanded lightly to 180 grit. The beveled parts need some sanding, and that includes those sharp edges. Round those over to avoid some nasty splinters. All right, so let's do a glue up. We can start with the interior drawer compartment with the front apron and the rear apron. We don't have to worry about the legs just yet. The good thing is, even though we have all these crazy angles, we only need 2 clamps, one on each side, and that should hold everything together as long as we're on a flat surface. So I've got my glue brush, got my glue ready to go. I'm gonna actually use Titebond Extend. We don't have that many joints, but it's enough in dry Denver that I get a little bit concerned about the glue seizing up on me before I have everything squared up. So Titebond Extend it is. Whoops. Those were not the holes I wanted to do. Actually, in this case, there is really no harm in pre-gluing tenons so that these will be there ready to go when it's time to glue that to the leg. Oops. Finally, I can add some clamps. Now when I add clamping pressure, I want to be right on the drawer support, right in line with it, and then I'm going to check for square. If anything's off, make the adjustment. And the adjustment is really as simple as just kind of pushing on it or replacing your clamp in a new position. Let that dry. After an overnight dry time, we can start finessing some things. There might be areas where you've got a sharp point that didn't get rounded over, or in my case, I've got a little bit of material that's just proud of the surface here. I want this to all be nice and smooth and level, so when our top sits, it sits nice and even. Temperamental grain on that side, so it's good for that. Let's go back this way. There we go. Nice and smooth. So the next thing we need to do is measure for our shelves. Now I have the unit upside down, got a little hold fast here, holding it down to the bench, and the legs are just kind of dry assembled, no glue at this point. So to measure for the shelf, we need to know the distance between these legs. Now you might be tempted to just take a measurement from dado to dado and get a number, but that might not be accurate. This sort of highlights the reason why functionally we want those shelves there as stretchers, because there's a little bit of mobility here in the legs, and the further out you go on that leg, the more you can move it and the more inaccurate your measurement might be. So what I'm going to do is take a measurement here at the base where it meets the aprons, and then simply add the depth of each one of my dados, which each are 3/8. So whatever length I get here, I'm just going to add 3/4 of an inch, and that is essentially going to be the front to back dimension of the shelf. Now, the side to side dimension of the shelf, that's really up to you. Be careful if it goes too far in here, you got a knee banger. If it goes too far out this way, it just might look weird, right? So do whatever you think looks good. I'm doing what I think looks good. And the material we're going to use for that is white oak. So essentially, we got to make a couple small panels. I'll cut some white oak from thicker stock, resawing to get the thickness that I'm looking for. Each board is jointed, and normally I'd use the planer to bring it to thickness, but because I'm pretty close to my final dimension already, I don't have a whole lot to spare, so I'm going to use the drum sander. At this point, I want the boards to be just a hair too thick. The boards are cut to width, and then organized into 2 panels. I can now joint the edges in preparation for glue up. Now for this glue up, I have to be pretty careful. I don't want these pieces to slip past one another. If I do that, then when I sand them afterwards, I'm actually going to make these shelves a little bit too thin. So right now, they're just slightly oversized. So when I do my final preparation, it'll be perfect. So I have to be careful to keep everything nice and level. Now you could use biscuits, dominoes, dowels, splines, whatever you want to do that. But a real good cheap way to keep the panels nice and flat is to use cauls. These are just some really nice hard pieces of white oak from a part that I wasn't using anymore, and I put some packing tape, clear packing tape on here. You want something that glue isn't going to stick to. And you basically just sandwich that panel and kind of go back and forth between pinching it this way, but then bringing the clamps in this way until everything is nice and flat. So that is what we're going to do. So let's get some glue on these edges. I'll apply a little bit of pressure using these 2 clamps. I leave enough material overhanging that I'll be able to use my cauls on them. On these parallel clamps, I really like to have at least one opposing clamp. If you clamp all in the same direction, sometimes you can induce a cup. Okay, now I haven't really hammered down on these yet, just enough that I could lift the clamps and start applying the cauls. The other side. Okay, now I haven't really cranked down on these either, so I can go back to these clamps, firm those up, and one last round on the caul clamps, tighten those up a little more. And that should be a dead flat panel when we're done. Now I'm actually using Titebond's speed set glue. Only takes about 15 minutes for this stuff to set up and I can take it out of the clamps. But what I'm really concerned about here is long-term exposure of metal plus oak plus something with water in it. You tend to get stains, right? So I want to give this at least that 15 minutes, then I'll be able to loosen the clamps, clean up the material underneath, or just put a little space between the bar of the clamp and the wood itself. And that way you don't get those black marks. Now once these panels are dry, we're going to mark them up with some pencils so I can gauge my progress and smooth them out however we want to. I'll start with a scraper and then move to some sanding. Now, if you remember, I left the panels just a little bit thick, and I could scrape and sand that edge until we get a nice fit, like that. Now both ends of our shelf are going to receive a little bit of a curvature. It's going to be about a 1/2 inch. So on each side, measure a 1/2 inch down. And now I'm just going to use a little drawing bow here to get a curve, that intersects with the center point, but then passes through those 1/2 inch lines. Okay, we'll do this on both shelves, and we'll cut and smooth that curve. Because this is end grain, I'm going to sand it a lot. And I'll go 1 grit higher than my highest grit that I'm using on the flat areas. In this case, I'll go to 220. You'll never regret spending extra time making your end grain look good. The edges get the 1/8 inch round over, but I avoid the areas that are going to sit in that leg dado. Now on each of my shelves, I've gone from one of the curved ends here, and marked back 3 inches. That's how much the shelf protrudes into the inside leg area of the desk. So all we need to do is grab 2 of our legs. I've got a front left and my rear left, and I'm just going to line this up with the pencil mark here. And bring my other piece in to the other pencil mark. It's a little awkward, but you definitely want to do this without glue, so you can kind of get your brain wrapped around what's happening here. So it's going to be something like that for the glue up. Then I'm going to come in with a clamp and hold it in place. The reason we're doing this is because we need to test to make sure we got this distance correct. So I want to get access to those mortises. Flip this guy over. And now once again, everything is dry. I just want to make sure that the distance here works. Oh yeah. There we go. So now we can be pretty confident that if we add a little bit of glue here, we should not have any problems with the final step in assembly. So now we can glue these guys together for realsies. Yes. That's looking good. And the other side gets the same treatment, just in reverse. All right, now it's time to do the final glue up. I cut a few little blocks that essentially offset the angles on the outside, so when we clamp this thing together, we don't have the clamps just slipping all over the place. And I put a little double stick tape on here just to kind of discourage it from sliding around. So we'll get glue in all the mortises. I actually have this upside down right now. It's going to go like this in the final orientation, but this allows me to access the mortises and makes the gluing process a little bit easier. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now let's get these little wedges in place. Okay, and then clamps. Ooh. I just noticed we're in a bit of a pickle here. I got to cut some more of these blocks very quickly because I can't squeeze from here to here. I'm bringing this whole thing together at the front, so I've actually got to have a smaller clamp here and a smaller clamp there, and I'm talking when I need to be cutting. Yeah, this is why you do dry assemblies, but that one just escaped my attention. But I really just want to close up the gaps. You don't need a whole lot of pressure to do that. All right, well that's not how I usually like my glue ups to go, but we did get everything done. Hopefully it'll give you a few tips for your glue up if you do something similar you got to think ahead with this stuff. And unfortunately, it's Sunday, so my brain's elsewhere. I've got some barbecue on the smoker, so kind of multitasking. But let's flip this guy around, get it on its legs. All right, it's looking pretty good.